Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this, our second session on our class on church history. Before we begin, just a couple of things that I would like to mention. First of all, I do want to let you know once again, as if you don't already, we are in the midst of Holy Week, and that means a couple of things for us. It means that we will be having an online Maundy Thursday service tomorrow. It will be published online sometime tomorrow afternoon. So you'll be able to access it whenever you wish, and it will involve communion. So you might want to be prepared to be ready to take communion at home at your convenience. Also do want to mention that we will be having a Good Friday meditation. We don't often do individual Good Friday services in our church. We often rely upon the Ministerial Association to do an ecumenical service. And so that's what this year though, with that not happening, we will be doing again a meditation that will be posted online. Also then again, of course, that means that Easter will also be done online, and we'll be with you here next Sunday morning. Also just note that you know that I have continued to struggle with technical issues, things such as sound, and I thought I had everything pretty well figured out. Turns out I didn't. Had a little technical difficulty this morning. So I am using this little microphone. I hope that's not going to be too distracting, but I'll continue to work on things. As a matter of fact, I have ordered a piece of equipment, but Amazon is not delivering everything as rapidly as they typically do. So I'm still looking at another 2 weeks before that thing is supposed to arrive. And, praise the Lord, all my troubles shall be settled when that piece of equipment comes. No doubt that's not going to be true. No doubt more issues are going to arise, but at least I'll be confronting them at that point with that new piece of equipment. Also, just want to let you know that just before we began to record, got a telephone call from Dick and Karen Dietz. They are proud grandparents, baby born in Columbus to Jamie and Allison. The baby is in the neonatal intensive care unit down there, but comes in at 4 pounds 6 ounces and 17 inches long. So all that sounds wonderful, and our congratulations do go out to them. Okay, well, let's get rolling on church history here. As I said last week, questions are welcome, and if you had questions, I invited you to email them to me, and I would hopefully be able to address them this morning. And 2 questions did come in, and so I'm going to try to address them. The first had to do with the relationship of Peter to the founding of the church. That came because Jesus, as we all know, told Peter, "On this rock I will build my church," talking apparently about him. And then maybe the question arose because last week I said that many people consider St. Paul to be the founder of the church. Let me address that for just a moment. The reason that they might talk about St. Paul being the founder of the church, I mean, in our minds at least, Jesus is, of course, the founder of the Christian church. Certainly provided the impetus for it, but St. Paul was the one who went out and, quite frankly, established the theology that underlies the church, the church structure that we all operate under. He taught the churches, he established churches around the Roman world, and in effect was the one primarily who got things going. So that is why some people say that St. Paul was the founder of the church. Now, what's this business all about regarding St. Peter? Well, remember that it all came from the story that we, again, all know about when Jesus was walking along the road with his disciples, and he said to them, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples answered, "Well, some people say that you are John the Baptist come back from the dead. Some say that you are Elijah or one of the prophets." And then Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" And apparently there was some silence there for a moment until finally Peter spoke up, and he said, "You are the Christ. You are the anointed one. You are the Messiah." And Jesus said, "You're right, but flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven has let you know about this." And then he went on to say, "And I say that you are Peter, Remember that his name was not originally Peter, it was Simon. And it was at that point that Jesus gave him the Greek name Petros, which means rock. And then he went on to say, Jesus did, you are Peter, the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. Wow, well, pretty incredible thing to say. And so what in the world could that possibly mean? Well, it's especially troubling for we Protestants. It doesn't really seem to affect or be much of a problem for our Catholic brothers and sisters. I mean, they understand they understand Peter to have been the first pope, and that the church in Rome had such strong prominence that therefore he was the one on whom the church was built. We Protestants are going, well, wait a second. The church was not built on Peter, so what in the world did all of this mean? Well, I suppose it could have meant a couple of different things. We can take a look at them very briefly. One of them might mean, yeah, maybe we're just wrong. Maybe we Protestants, in our efforts at the Reformation to deliver ourselves from all things Roman, maybe we went too far. Maybe we need to think about Peter being the founder of the church, or on the foundation on which the church is built. But we don't have necessarily to go there. Let's take a look at the language of that verse, on this rock I will build my church, and take a look at really what this says. Now this gets pretty complicated because we're looking at ancient languages here. Let me say that the Greek language is a very complicated, a very rich language, much more so than English. Things are simply much simpler in English, a lot more complicated in Greek. If you actually were to decide to study what's called Koine Greek, the language in which the New Testament was written, what you would discover is that every word has more possibilities than we give them in English. Every word has a gender connotation. It either has a feminine or a masculine meaning. Also, all kinds of declinations in terms of past, future, present, formal versus common, and all kinds of things. And if you're going to learn Greek, you have to learn all of those things and be able to pass them on tests, and that will help you read the Greek New Testament. So knowing all of that, and it gets even more complicated because while the New Testament is written in Greek, Jesus was speaking in Aramaic. So we have to take the Aramaic, translate that into Greek, and then we translate that back into English. And so there are problems at every step of the way. But apparently what's going on in this verse is that Jesus gives Simon that new name, Petros. You are Peter. And then he goes on to say it upon this rock. However, in the Greek, that word, this rock, is different from the proper name rock that Jesus gave Peter. It's actually a feminine noun. And when he says upon this rock, not using the same word that was used to give Peter his new name, it actually sounds as if there is some other rock in place here. And what it sounds like is that Jesus was actually saying the rock on which the church will be founded is the foundation of your confession, Peter, of who I am, that I am the Messiah, the Son of God. So that's what's going on here. At least that's one way of thinking about it, rather than Peter being the actual the founder or the foundation of the Christian church. I suppose there's one other way to put it. This will make everybody nervous, kind of makes me a little nervous too. But we all know what the Bible actually is, and that is that the Bible is comprised of books that were compiled over periods of time and from a lot of different sources and so forth. And so what all this sounds for all the world like is perhaps, and I'm not saying it is, I'm just tossing this out as an idea, that this was an insertion by the Roman Church to give Peter added authority and also to give them, the church at Rome, greater authority in the church, being the primary church. And therefore now we have the Roman Catholic Church. Well, okay, again, that might make some people uncomfortable. Like I said, it probably makes me a little uncomfortable as well. But nevertheless, that's one possible explanation. So anyway, there are some thoughts on the whole business about Peter being the foundation of the Christian church rather than something else. Another question came in, and that had to do with the Gospel of Thomas. There's a lot of intrigue, a lot of interest, a lot of curiosity about the Gospel of Thomas. I suppose primarily because there's this whole idea about, wait a minute, there's a new gospel out there, and if there is a new gospel out there, what is it? And why was it hidden for so long? Was someone trying to repress the message that was contained in this gospel? I mean, it sounds all the world like something out of a Dan Brown novel, like the Da Vinci Code. Maybe it was. Maybe there's something in there about the Gospel of Thomas. I really don't know. But again, it sounds like there's a lot of intrigue going on here. And in some ways, I guess it's fair to say that there was. The Gospel of Thomas was discovered, buried in the desert, near a place called Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in 1945. Now, it was not alone. They discovered a collection of books in the desert in 1945. One of those books was the Gospel of Thomas, and it has certainly generated more interest than the other documents that were found there in the desert at that time. It does appear to be, scholars are agreed that it is an ancient document. They date it as early as, say, the AD 60s and as late as the AD 40s, which puts it perhaps generally about the same time as the other Gospels were written. But the fact remains that it was hidden in the desert and not made a part of what we call our canon of Scripture. Now, the canonical Gospels, the canon, what canon really means is catalog. So our Bible, the books that we have in the Bible, is the catalog of the books the church decided were going to be authoritative. So why did they not decide that the Gospel of Thomas was going to be authoritative? Well, I'll let you know that there are some things that are different about the Gospel of Thomas. One is that it is not, like the other four Gospels that we have in our Bibles, it is not a biography of Jesus. It does not tell the story of the Gospel, or the story of Jesus, maybe starting with the birth narratives and working through his life all the way down to his death and resurrection. It's basically a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus. And I'll get back to them in just a minute. But I want to say something about why in the world may this have been hidden in the desert and not made a part of our canon of scriptures. By the way, the Gospel of Thomas is mentioned in some other early Christian writings, so it was known among the early Christians to be out there in existence. So we are given the question once again of why was it hidden in the desert? And there is a good theoretical answer to that. About one half of the sayings, and if I didn't mention it, there are 114 sayings of Jesus that are contained in the Gospel of Thomas. And of these 114, about half of them are reflected in the other four Gospels. But the rest of them, they're different. And the idea here is that they are Gnostic sayings. Gnostic refers to that they are a part of Gnosticism. Now, that may not be a word that you are familiar with. It's a confusing word. It was hard for me for years to get a handle on just what Gnosticism was. Still not sure that I get it. But the word that underlies Gnostic or Gnosticism is the Greek word gnosis, and it means knowledge. Now, we know the word best not because we ever talk very much about the gnosis of anything, but we do use the word in its negative sense. You make a word negative by adding the letter A at the front, and so we often talk about agnostic. So if Gnostic or gnosis means knowledge, agnostic means I don't know. So that's where all of that comes from. And so what Gnosticism is really all about is that it typically refers to a system of secret knowledge, that there are things that are hidden. And some sects or groups or movement might be saying, hey, come over here, we've got some secret knowledge that if you join us, you can get in on this. And that means, of course, that Gnosticism has never really gone away. There are still, I think, Gnostic movements out there. Don't hear much talk about Gnosticism, but just for instance, I rather suspect, like for instance, something like Scientology sounds to me like a Gnostic movement. Mormonism sounds like Gnosticism to me as the more I dig into it. I don't know a whole lot about the Jehovah's Witnesses, but there's a lot of secret knowledge going on in Jehovah's Witness stuff. And so therefore, it sounds like Gnosticism to me too. Now, whatever you do, don't take anything I just said seriously. I already said that I never really got a good understanding of what Gnosticism was, and so I still may not know, and those things may in fact not be Gnostic. What we need to know about Gnosticism, though, is that it was seen as a great heresy in the early church, and the early church did its best to stamp out Gnosticism. Now, the other works that were found with the Gospel of Thomas in Nag Hammadi Desert were Gnostic works. And so it makes sense that if the others were Gnostic, then the Gospel of Thomas was seen to be Gnostic as well. And so the idea here was that in the midst of the effort to stamp out Gnosticism, particularly the work of a man named Athanasius, and we're going to be hearing more about him. He was a giant in the early church. In his efforts to stamp out Gnosticism, it may very well have been that those works were taken and hidden in the desert so that they would not be destroyed. Is that what happened? I'm not sure. I don't know. But it's at least an explanation of what the Gospel of Thomas is and how it got to be buried in the desert. Now, if you still have a lot of curiosity about the Gospel of Thomas and what it's all about, I'm going to share with you a couple of, well, several actually, of the sayings that can be found in the Gospel of Thomas. And remember, that's all the Gospel of Thomas is these collections of saying from Jesus, about half of which are reflected in the other four Gospels. So here are some sayings from the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, "Lucky is the lion that the human will eat, so that the lion becomes human, and foul is the human that the lion will eat, and the lion will still become human." I'm really glad that doesn't show up on the lectionary for me to preach on every now and then. And there's several of those here in this collection I'm going to read you. Here's another one. "And he said, the human one is like a wise fisherman who cast his net into the sea and drew it up from the sea full of little fish. Among them, the wise fisherman discovered a fine, large fish. And he threw all the little fish back into the sea and easily chose the large fish. Anyone here who has good ears had better listen." So here's a lesson from the mouth of Jesus. If you're going to do any fishing this summer, throw the little ones back, keep the big ones. Okay, here's another one. Jesus saw some babies nursing. He said to his disciples, "These nursing babies are like those who enter the Father's domain." They said to him, "Then we shall enter the Father's domain as babies?" And Jesus said to them, "When you make the two into one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, and when you make the male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female be female, when you make eyes in the place of an eye, a hand in place of a hand, a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you will enter the Father's domain." Well, I'm not sure about you, but I don't find a lot of clarity there in terms of how to enter the Father's domain. It still sounds pretty mysterious, but that's what the Gospel of Thomas tells us. A couple more here. Jesus said, "No one can enter a strong man's house and take it by force without tying his hands. Then one can loot the house." And his disciples said, "When will you appear to us, and when will we see you?" And Jesus said, might want to write this down, "When you strip without being ashamed, and you take your clothes and put them under your feet like little children and trample them, then you will see the Son of the Living One, and you will not be afraid." Okay, I guess we can be glad that public nudity did not become a sacrament in the Christian church, which, hey, might have if we'd have taken the Gospel of Thomas more seriously. And then Jesus said, "The Father's imperial rule is like a person who wanted to kill someone powerful. While still at home, he drew his sword and thrust it into the wall to find out whether his hand would go in. Then he killed the powerful one." Okay, last one. St. Peter said to them, "Make Mary leave us, for females don't deserve life." And Jesus said, "Look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every female who makes herself male will enter the domain of heaven." Okay, now hopefully you have a better understanding of the Gospel of Thomas, what it is, where it came from, and some of what's in there. Okay, we ended last time with talk about Nero and the persecution in which the Christians in Rome underwent during his time. Well, we're going to still talk about persecution for a bit this morning, because in the first period of church history, persecution was very important. And, you know, it's a heritage that we still carry. We still rather think of persecution as sort of being an essential part of Christian life. And we sort of think suffering is essential. After all, Jesus had to suffer, so it's not all that unusual that those who follow him might have to suffer. And in fact, many Christians have suffered for their faith, and that was particularly true in the first 3 centuries of church life. As a matter of fact, during the first 300 years of Christian life, Christians were never really safe. Well, why weren't they safe? What was it about Christians that made them so awful? Actually, we read something last week about how they lived and how they actually went about being what they thought Jesus said they would be, which was the salt of the earth and the light of the world. But the world did not necessarily see them in that way. So what was it about them that the Roman world objected to so strenuously? Well, we did talk last week about a couple of things. One was this whole business of infanticide. They baptized babies. It was easy to start a rumor that they were drowning those babies. And the other was cannibalism. What do you do when you get together? We eat the body and drink the blood of our Lord. Ooh, wow, that sounds terrible. It sounds disgusting. But there were some other things that were going on. One was that the Christians refused to worship the traditional Roman gods. Romans had lots of gods. And you know how it is. Society just has certain expectations of its citizens. And when anyone refuses to go along with those traditions and expectations, then there must be something kind of wrong with those people. Part of that was they refused to acknowledge the divinity of the Roman emperor. They were not going to bow down to a man. They knew who God was, and they weren't going to do it. That certainly put them in a bad way. There were also some of them who would not serve in the army. How could they serve in the army? Jesus said, "Return no one evil for evil. Someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to them the other also." How does that apply to the life of a soldier? So some, at least, wouldn't serve as a soldier. Then there was the matter of women. In spite of what I just read from the Gospel of Thomas, Christians gave women a pretty high place in their society. They were taken seriously. The Apostle Paul told them that in God's sight there is no slave or free, Gentile or Jew, male or female, all are equal. Well, because of the high place that women were given in Christian society, the way the rumors went was they practice free love. They are truly disgusting bunch of people. So the Christians were different. And because they were different, every now and then somebody in Roman society would complain about it. And when they would complain, the Roman authorities would feel somehow duty bound to do something about it. If not every time, at least some of the time. Had to do something about it. Well, here's what they did about it. And I want to read a quote from a Roman leader named Pliny. And Pliny was a government official in a certain part of the empire. And I'm going to read this quote. It was in the year AD 112 that Pliny, who was in Turkey, wrote the Roman Emperor Trajan for advice on how to deal with the Christians. And he said, I have hesitated a great deal on the question of whether there should be any distinction of ages, whether the weak should have the same treatment as the more robust, whether those who recant should be pardoned, or whether a man who has ever been a Christian should gain nothing by ceasing to be such, whether the name itself, even if innocent of crime, should be punished, or only the crimes attaching to that name. Meanwhile, this is the course that I have adopted in the case of those brought before me as Christians. I ask them if they are Christians. If they admit it, I repeat the question a second and a third time, threatening capital punishment. If they persist, I sentence them to death. For I do not doubt that whatever kind of crime it may be, to which they have confessed, their pertinacity and inflexible obstinacy should certainly be punished. Any who denied that they were or had been Christians, I considered should be discharged because they called upon the gods at my dictation and did reverence with incense and wine to your image, again meaning the emperor, especially because they cursed Christ, a thing which, it is said, genuine Christians cannot be induced to do. Well, the emperor assured the governor that he was doing the right thing. Anybody who denied being a Christian and showed it by doing reverence to the gods should be regarded as innocent, however likely it was that he or she had been a Christian in the past. Okay, so that's kind of how the Romans were thinking about and treating the Christians. And a lot of stories of martyrdom came out of during that time. One of them was a bishop in the town of Smyrna. Smyrna was one of the towns of the Greek and Roman world. And by the time this story happened, in the latter part of the 100s AD, there was a bishop in Smyrna, very old man. His name was Polycarp. And the story goes that St. John had lived in Smyrna, at least for a while, and that it may very well have been that Polycarp, as a young boy, knew the Apostle John. Hard to say whether any of that's true, but it was speculation about Polycarp. Well, the persecution of the Christians was active during that time. And if a person would not recant their faith, then they were to be executed in the arena. And so Polycarp was called to question for his faith. And he said that, well, during this course of his investigation, I need to back up just a little bit and say that one of the accusations about Christians was that while the Romans worshipped many gods, Christians, of course, only worshipped one. So in the Roman mind, that was as good as atheism. So in their investigation of Polycarp, what they said was, denounce the atheist. Well, that was easy. Polycarp said, okay, I denounce the atheist, knowing that he really wasn't an atheist. But they knew that they were not going to be tricked like that. So they made him, pressed him harder to deny Christ, to defile the name of Christ and so forth. And Polycarp said, 86 years have I served him, and he hath done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who has saved me? So they burned him. Seems like the thing to do, don't you think? Anyway, the persecution went on. It didn't happen all the time under every emperor, but again, in that first 300 years, Christians were always in danger of persecution being an issue. At some point, there was an edict that went out from the emperor that everybody in the empire was going to have to be brought together in terms of what they believed. And in one sense, they didn't really care what they believed, but they had to all acknowledge that there was a supreme God. It was called the Unconquerable Son, and everybody had to make confession of the Unconquerable Son as being the primary God, and then after that, do whatever you want. And of course, Christians and Jews just simply wouldn't do it. And the decree was that if people would not, then they would be executed. One of the famous stories that came out during that time was a story of a woman named Perpetua. She and 4 associates were condemned to death for being Christians. Now, Perpetua was a wealthy young woman. She was also a mother. And when she was condemned to death, her family urged her to deny her new faith and to thereby be saved from execution. She declined to do it. Now, as it happened, she had a slave named Felicitas. And remember that in Roman world, about 50% of the people were slaves. So Felicitas, as it happened, was pregnant. And in childbirth, they said to her, "You think this pain is bad? Just think what it's going to be like when you're torn apart by beasts in the arena." And Felicitas said, "But when I face the beast, there will be another who will live in me and suffer for me, since I shall be suffering for him." Well, they were all, Perpetua and Felicitas and the other 4, were all brought to the arena, and the other 4 were killed by the beasts. And then, the story gets, if it's not weird enough so far, it gets even weirder. Perpetua and Felicitas were then attacked by a ferocious cow. And Perpetua asked to be allowed to retie her hair, because loose hair was considered to be a sign of mourning, and she considered her martyrdom to be a time of joy. And then, bruised and bleeding, Perpetua and Felicitas were executed by the sword, and a Christian woman adopted Felicitas' baby. Okay, another nice story there for you. The persecutions all continued, and it went up until the last and most violent persecution actually started out being related to the army. As I said earlier, many Christians would not serve in the army, but over the years, there were always those who did. And there were also Christians who did decide to at least try to leave the army. And then in the year 303, under the Emperor Diocletian, the persecution of the Christians and the church became much more severe, and started destroying churches and destroying all the copies of the Bible and so forth and so on. And there was a particular soldier. His name was Marinus. I'm going to read you a paragraph about his story. And this is told by, actually, this person, his name was Eusebius. And Eusebius was the very first person who who wrote a history of the church. And Eusebius tells the story of this soldier named Marinus. And it turns out that he was about to be promoted. And a rival for the promotion protested that Marinus was a Christian. And after examination, the judge gave Marinus 3 hours in which to repent. Taking him to the church, his bishop pulled aside his robe and disclosed a copy of the Gospels and a sword. And he said that the bishop said that Marinus must choose one or the other. And Marinus chose the Bible. And the bishop said, hold fast to God, and strengthened by him, mayest thou obtain what thou hast chosen. Go in peace. And Marinus was beheaded, or as Eusebius put it, made perfect by martyrdom. Goes on, Eusebius said that in Egypt, thousands, both men and women and children, despising the present life for the sake of the Savior's doctrines, submitted to death in various shapes, some after being tortured with scrapings and the rack. The most dreadful scourgings were finally committed to the flames. Some were nailed with the head downward and kept alive until they were destroyed by starving on the cross. Stories also told about a pitiful march of nearly 100 Christian men, women, and children, all with their right eye put out and their left foot crippled, on their way to slavery in the mines. Okay, could I have done without all of that? Could you have done without all of that? Maybe, but maybe not. I think it's important to understand something about who we are, where we have come from, and what people have undergone because of their faith, at least in the very earliest days of the church. And of course, persecution has never truly ended. We could spend some time talking about that, and perhaps we will at some point, but not now. It is important, finally, to say martyr means witness. And in spite of the intense persecution and the martyrdom, many more people were becoming Christians. And one of the early church writers, a man named Tertullian, wrote a famous saying, which was, "The blood of martyrs is the seed of the church." Okay. Things changed big time in the year 312 AD. There was a Christian general named Constantine who was fighting to become emperor. And he had a rival who also had an army like Constantine did, and they met in battle, and Constantine won. Now he said that the reason he won was before the battle, he had a vision of the cross in the sky, and he heard the words, "By this sign, conquer." And so he followed that advice, and what he did was he had the shields of his soldiers painted with the letters Chi and Rho. There is a thing called the Chi Rho cross. You've seen it, even though you may not have known what it was, but it looks like an X with a P in the middle of it. And that Chi Rho cross, made up of the Chi and the Rho, those are the first two Greek letters in the name Christos, or Christ. So he decorated his soldiers' shields with that Christian sign, went out and won the war, and became emperor. Well, he obviously felt pretty good about Christianity, gave him all that incredible victory, and so he made Christianity the state religion. Now you might say, was he a Christian? Well, yeah, he probably was. However, he was not baptized until he was on his deathbed. And that was actually a fairly common practice, because it was felt like, I'm not going to get baptized until the bitter end, so therefore all my sins will be wiped out all at once, and I won't have to worry about the things that I do after I'm baptized. So he was baptized. And again, things changed rapidly after Constantine, as a Christian, became an emperor. For one thing, well, the big thing was persecution ceased. You know, what a tremendous relief that must have been to the Christians. Wow, okay, one of our guys made it to the top. We're safe now. And in fact, that's true. And things, again, did change. One was that there were church buildings around before that time. The earliest church building that archaeologists have found comes from the year about 235 AD, But after Constantine became emperor, then great cathedrals began to go up all around the empire. St. Peter's Basilica, the first St. Peter's Basilica was started to be built in Rome. There were churches that were built over the major sites of the ministry and life of Jesus. In Bethlehem, at the place of his birth, or where they suspected his birth had occurred. Also, the place of his death and burial. More things that we could talk about there, but you can't go on forever about every little thing. But other things changed socially. New human laws were put into place that relieved human suffering. Before Constantine came to power, a father could legally sell his child into slavery or legally kill him. Became illegal after that. Divorce was very common. One Roman teased about another Roman saying he been married 1,000 times. I don't know how literally true that is. You'd think somebody would learn their lesson before the 1,000th wedding. But also, for instance, one Roman divorced his wife because he saw her walking bareheaded outside. So divorce was very, very common. And Constantine changed a lot of that. Constantine made it illegal for married men to have concubines. He also protected a wife's property rights. In addition to that, prisons were reformed, hospitals were established. So Constantine did some good things. So it sure sounds like victory. The church's struggle, battle with the empire was over. But was it a victory? What do you know about people who join a movement if they are perhaps likely to be persecuted and maybe even put to death if they join that movement? Well, one thing you know about them is they're sincere. They mean it. They're putting their lives on the line for what they believe. What does it say about the church that's made up of that kind of people? That's one serious organization with a very serious purpose. So the question is, will it be different when it is no longer persecuted? Will it be different when it actually becomes favored in a society? Will it be different when maybe you become a Christian because it'll look good on your resume? Or because you might make good business connections at church? Will it be different when someone might be more likely to get a promotion in their governmental business when it becomes favored as a society? What happens when the church is no longer separate from society, but becomes identified with the culture? When you can't necessarily tell the difference anymore between the church and the culture. When the culture becomes a Christian culture, then whatever it does is okay because it's Christian. We're a Christian culture. We do Christian things, whatever they are. The problem is, as Søren Kierkegaard said, Kierkegaard being a Danish philosopher and theologian, very, very profound, Kierkegaard said, when everybody is a Christian, nobody is a Christian. Well, what happened to Constantine was that the church fundamentally changed. And it has been that way ever since. Nations and churches are identified as one. And we saw all that happening. It's still that way in at least certain places. We can think of Europe, the state churches that existed there, and how the Church of England is still very much associated with the government in Britain. Even though apparently not too many people are attending it these days, it is still a state church. So the churches and the nations became identified, and again, it has been that way ever since, and it still is that way. And that led to something that has been called civic religion, meaning that when people in the culture identify their religious responsibilities with their religious responsibilities with their civic responsibilities. Being a citizen means the same thing as being a Christian. When that happens, how can you tell who you are really worshiping or what you are really worshiping? I'm going to go back to Kierkegaard again. One of the books that he wrote was called The Attack on Christendom. Now, please understand that the word Christendom does not mean Christianity. It does mean the established church, in his case, the established Christian church in the nation of Denmark. And I've always been struck and always remembered this phrase from when I read The Attack on Christendom all those many years ago. But Kierkegaard said this. He said, "In the magnificent cathedral, the Honorable and Right Reverend Geheimner General Oberhof Prädikant, the elect favorite of the fashionable world, appears before an elect company and preaches with emotion upon the text he himself selected. God has elected the base things of the world and the things that are despised, and nobody laughs." Okay, the challenges of separating church and culture remains. And it is a crucial matter even for we American Christians. Now I know that I certainly grew up, and probably you did too, believing that to be a good Christian meant being a good American. You really couldn't separate those two. But is it true? Is it ever true? Has it ever been true? Now, I understand how challenging that question is, and I'm not here to provide any answers to it. But I do think that it is essential for us to think about that question and come up with an answer for ourselves. What's the difference? Is there one? And if there is one, how do I choose? Well, thank you for your time. We shall get together this time next week for session 3 of Church History.